They didn't recognize him at first. The man coming out of the tree line looked more like something the jungle had chewed up and spit back out than a United States soldier. His uniform was shredded and stained dark with mud and sweat, one sleeve torn halfway up the arm. His face was drawn tight, streaked with grime, eyes sunken but alert, over his shoulders using a length of webbing as an improvised harness. He dragged two limp bodice American uniforms, loose and heavy, boots catching on roots as he pulled them over the rough ground. Behind him, half stumbling but still on his feet, came a third man, leaning on a rifle like a crutch, one leg wrapped in a bloodied bandage. The perimeter guards at the fire support base just outside Quang Tro froze, fingers tightening on their rifles. It was late afternoon, the sky turning a dull, hazy orange over the distant hills, the air thick with the smell of burned powder and wet vegetation. They weren't expecting anything from that direction. No scheduled patrols, no planned resupply. The jungle on that side was simply marked on their maps as bad ground. For a long second, nobody moved. Then one of the younger Marines on the wire squinted, took a half step forward and whispered, "No way. That's Lieutenant Walker." The name hit the men on the line like a shock. Lieutenant James Walker had been listed as missing, presumed dead, 72 hours earlier. His platoon had walked into a nightmare on a nameless ridge south of the DMZ. Survivors had stumbled back, bloodied and incomplete, faces hollow as they tried to explain how the lieutenant had gone down covering their withdrawal. The report had been filed. The chaplain had been notified. His platoon sergeant had written a letter to Walker's parents that started with the words every family dreaded. "I'm sorry to tell you." But now, here he was, dragging two unconscious men behind him and leading a third who should not have been standing, let alone walking. "Get a corpsman," somebody shouted, the spell breaking. "Move, move." Walker crossed the outer line of concertina wire with the last remnants of his strength. His boots slipped in the mud, knees buckling, but he refused to let go of the men he was hauling. A corpsman and two Marines rushed forward to take the weight, easing the wounded down onto stretchers. Up close, they could see the toll written across Walker's body. There was a deep purple bruise blooming under his ribs. His left hand was swollen and blistered, and his right eye was almost closed from swelling. Still, his jaw was set like he was in formation, waiting for orders. "Doc, this one's critical," Walker rasped, nodding toward one of the men he'd brought out. "He took shrapnel in the back. I kept the bleeding down, but he's running on fumes. The other two can wait a minute, but not him." The corpsman stared at him. "Sir, we thought you were—" "Yeah," Walker cut in, voice flat. "So did they." He tilted his head toward the jungle behind him. "Where's the CO?" Captain Harlan, the company commander, arrived moments later, ducking out from under a camouflage net that served as a makeshift command post cover. He was older than Walker by a decade, with hard lines carved into his face from too many months in country. For just a fraction of a second, he stopped dead when he saw the lieutenant standing there. "Jesus Christ, Jim," he muttered. "We wrote you off." "Should have held that paperwork a little longer, sir," Walker said, managing the ghost of a smile. It disappeared as quickly as it had come. "We've got bigger problems." Harlan's eyes sharpened. "Talk." Walker shifted his weight, steadying himself as if the ground might move. "My platoon didn't just get hit by a random patrol," he said. "We walked into a prepared killing ground. They had an L-shaped ambush, set and ready, mortar dialed in, machine guns placed to rake the path, and somebody fed them our route, or they've been watching us longer than we thought. Either way, it wasn't luck." Harlan didn't like the sound of that. It showed in the way his mouth tightened, in the way his gaze flicked briefly toward the map board under the net. "All right," he said. "Start from the beginning. What the hell happened on that ridge?" The question pulled Walker back, away from the sandbags and antennas and jeep tracks of the fire support base, into the green, suffocating maze where it had all started 3 days earlier. The jungle in that sector wasn't just thick. It was alive in a way that made men from Ohio or Texas or New York feel like they'd landed on another planet. Vines as thick as wrists hung from the trees. The ground was soft in some places and treacherously slick in others, and every inch of the air felt heavy enough to drink. Sound didn't behave the way it did back home. It bounced and twisted, found strange echoes, hid threats behind a wall of insect noise. That morning had begun like too many others, a mission brief delivered under dim light, a red grease pencil circling their objective on a plastic-covered map, the phrase "suspected infiltration route" floating in the air like a curse. Intelligence had flagged a narrow valley and a low ridgeline as likely paths for North Vietnamese army movement toward American positions. The job was simple on paper. Move out, recon the area, look for signs of enemy activity, and, if possible, disrupt it. Walker's platoon had been tired but steady. The kind of tired that settles into a man's bones after months of heat, patrols, and half-slept nights. Still, they moved when ordered. 4 squads, radio operator, machine gun teams, and Walker up front with his point man. They followed a narrow trail carved by feet that had walked this ground long before Americans arrived. Farmers, guerrillas, soldiers who knew how to vanish between the trees. Even before the first shot, something had felt off to Walker. It wasn't anything he could put neatly into a sentence. The jungle looked normal, if such a thing existed in Vietnam. The air was thick, but not unusually so. The birds were loud, the insects relentless. But there was a pattern in the way the undergrowth grew that didn't match what he'd come to expect. A branch where it shouldn't be. Grass pressed down where nobody from his platoon had stepped. He slowed the column with a hand signal, scanning ahead. The path bent gently to the right, sliding along the base of a ridge. To the left, the ground rose sharply in a slope that offered good fields of fire. To the right, it dropped down into a shallow gully choked with brush. As he studied the terrain, the realization formed. This was a perfect place for an ambush. Too perfect. He considered calling a halt and pulling back to find another route. But the objective lay ahead, and the map in his mind told him they were close. They'd been out for hours already, sweat soaking their flak jackets, packs digging into their shoulders. Harlan wanted that valley checked. Walker had a job to do. He raised his hand to signal a staggered extension off the trail, spreading the platoon wider when the world exploded. The first blast wasn't a single crack. It was a rolling concussion that tore the air apart. Claymore Mines Command detonated, aimed right at the compressed line of his men. The front half of the column vanished in a spray of dirt, shrapnel, and broken branches. The shockwave hit Walker like a sledgehammer. He felt himself leave his feet, then slam hard into the ground, ears ringing, lungs empty. His helmet shifted, slamming down over one eye. For a few heartbeats, he was blind and deaf, lost in a universe of white noise and dust. Then the gunfire started. AK-47s chattered from the slope to the left, slicing through the remnants of the platoon's formation. Another stream of fire came from somewhere to the front, cutting across the trail at a slight angle. Classic. An L-shaped ambush. They'd walk directly into the short leg, with the long leg waiting to rake them if they tried to pull back. Men were shouting, some orders, some prayers, some just raw pain. Walker forced himself onto his hands and knees, sucking in a breath that tasted like dirt and cordite. Shapes moved in front of him, his men, some down, some scrambling for cover. He saw Taylor, one of his machine gunners, dragging the M60 toward a fallen tree, trying to swing the barrel toward the slope. He saw Jackson, the radio operator, lying too still, hand set just out of reach. Training took over. Fear never really stopped, but it learned how to stand in the corner while something colder and more focused stepped forward. Walker crawled toward Jackson, rounds whipping overhead, leaves shredding around him. He grabbed the radio, rolled into a shallow depression, and forced his voice to cut through the static. He called for artillery, for smoke, for anything that could buy them a few seconds. As he spoke, he watched the terrain, the fields of fire, the flashes from enemy positions, the way the ambush was designed. And in that moment, he understood something every bit as terrifying as the storm of bullets around him. This wasn't a quick hit and run. This was a kill trap designed to wipe his platoon off the map. If someone didn't break its spine from the inside, not a single one of them was getting out of that valley alive. The gunfire didn't let up. It only intensified, growing into a sustained roar that shook the jungle and drowned out the ringing in Walker's ears. The NVA had planned this perfectly. Fields of fire overlapped. Angles converged, and every time one of his men tried to rise even a few inches, bursts of automatic fire forced them back to the ground. He needed to move, needed to think, needed to carve a line of survival out of a situation designed to bury them. He pushed himself against the base of a tree, trying to get a clearer look through the chaos. The air was thick with floating dust and shredded leaves. It looked almost like smoke, but carried the smell of torn vegetation instead of burning powder. Shapes darted between the trees on the enemy soldiers, repositioning, reloading, shouting to one another. Their confidence was obvious. They believed the ambush was already won. Walker keyed the radio again, his voice steady even as his chest tightened. He called in grid coordinates with the precision of a man who understood that one wrong digit could mean artillery landing on his own men instead of the ridge. When the fire direction center acknowledged, he exhaled slowly. He asked for airburst rounds first, something to disrupt the machine gun placements. Then, if they survived that phase, he'd adjust for smoke but artillery would take minutes. They didn't have minutes. A burst of AK fire ripped through the tree above him, showering him in splinters. He ducked instinctively. A faint shout reached him through the gunfire. Taylor had managed to get the M60 set behind the fallen tree, and he barked something that could have been cover, or "I'm dry," or simply a cry of effort. The M60 opened up with a heavy rhythmic thud, dash thud, dash thud, each burst forcing the enemy to dip their heads. But the position was too exposed. Walker crawled toward him, staying low enough that his nose brushed the jungle floor. Bullets cracked overhead like breaking branches. Taylor saw him approaching and shouted over the noise, Sir, they've got at least 2 MG nests up there. I see them, Walker said, scanning the slope. We need to shift right. Use the gully for cover. Taylor's face was streaked with sweat, his helmet slipping back on his head. Sir, if we move, we die if we stay, Walker cut in. Suppress the high nest. On my signal. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He crawled toward the center of the platoon's broken formation. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some moving, some frighteningly still. He grabbed whoever he could reach, giving quick, clipped orders. Move right. Use the drop. Stay low. Wait for the M60. The men nodded, despite the fear in their eyes. They trusted him, and trust demanded action. Walker positioned himself at the edge of the gully. It dipped sharply but offered enough cover to allow low crawling. Taylor's M60 barked again, heavier and more deliberate now. The fire poured into the upper ridge and the enemy guns flinched just long enough. Go! The men slid into the gully, one after another, dragging the wounded with them when possible. It wasn't orderly, not in the way manuals like to pretend combat could be, but it was survival. Walker stayed near the rear, firing short, controlled bursts to keep the enemy from advancing. A whistle sliced the air, high, sharp, unmistakable. Walker knew that sound intimately. Mortared. Down, he yelled, pushing 2 men deeper into the gully just as the first round hit behind them. The explosion was deafening. A second followed, then a third, walking closer with terrifying precision. They were bracketing the gully. He dragged a wounded private behind a thick root just in time for another blast to shake the ground. Dirt rained down over them, followed by branches and bits of stone. The private moaned, and Walker pressed a hand to his shoulder. Hold on. Stay with me. Then, through the rolling thunder of incoming rounds, he heard the distant thump of outbound artillery, American guns firing. He allowed himself one breath of hope. When the first airburst detonated over the ridge, it changed everything. Light flashed above the tree line, followed by a concussive wave that scattered debris. The enemy machine guns faltered. The rhythm of their fire broke apart as soldiers ducked, shifted, or threw themselves toward cover. Walker took the chance. Move up the gully. Keep going. His men scrambled, sometimes on hands and knees, sometimes dragging themselves when their legs refused to follow orders. He pushed forward with them, forcing his injured body to keep pace. They needed to break the kill zone entirely, to put the ridge behind them. The jungle, as cruel as it was, offered places to disappear if you knew where to look. Artillery thundered again, closer this time. Walker adjusted the radio, giving new coordinates through gritted teeth. Another airburst, then a series of He rounds slammed into the high ground. The ridge shook under the impact. Leaves and dust fell like rain. For a moment the ambush line collapsed, but the NVA didn't break. They rarely did. Even as the tree limbs fell around them, shapes emerged through the haze, firing from new angles, shifting positions with ruthless efficiency. One of Walker's corporals ahead of him shouted, "Sir, they're flanking the gully." Walker saw movement on their right, trying to cut off the exit. "Keep going," he ordered. "I'll handle it." He veered to the right, crawling out of the gully and into the thick brush. The enemy fire intensified immediately. Bullets zipped past his ears, tearing through. Leaves. He moved low, fast, using every bit of training drilled into him since OCS. He spotted an NVA soldier crouched behind a tree, rifle aimed toward the gully. Walker fired first. The enemy soldier slumped silently. He pushed deeper, clearing a path with short bursts, forcing the flanking team to hesitate. It was enough. His men slipped through the narrowing gap, stumbling into deeper jungle away from the ridge. Walker backed away, firing as he retreated until he felt the slope fall behind him. He turned and slid back into the gully, landing hard enough to rattle his ribs. When he caught up with the survivors, they were huddled behind a natural berm-winded, bleeding, shaken but alive. Taylor crawled over, breathing like he'd run a mile. "Sir, what now?" Walker looked back the way they'd come. The ridge still echoed with gunfire. The NVA would regroup, hunt them, try to finish what they'd started. They had no medic, little ammunition, and too many wounded to leave behind. He wiped the sweat and dirt from his eyes. "Now," he said quietly, "we get out of this jungle alive." It wasn't bravado. It was a promise. One he intended to keep even if it killed him. Because somewhere behind them, in the chaos of the ambush, a few men had been separated, wounded, left unconscious. And Walker wasn't the kind of leader who abandoned anyone. Not even when the odds said he should. Not even when the jungle tried to swallow him whole. Night fell on them like a curtain being pulled shut. One moment there was a dim, green-tinged light filtering through the canopy. And the next, it was as if someone had reached up and turned off the sky. In the jungle, darkness didn't come gradually. It dropped. Fast. Sudden. Absolute. They had put as much distance as they could between themselves and the ridge before that happened. Each step away from the ambush site had been a negotiation between urgency and exhaustion. The wounded slowed them, their weight shared between stronger shoulders, rifles slung awkwardly as men became crutches for one another. The air never cooled, only grew thicker, the humidity clinging to their skin like a wet blanket. When Walker finally called a halt, it was because he knew their bodies were close to shutting down. A small ravine offered partial cover, its sides rising just enough to shield them from casual observation. He signaled for a 360-degree security perimeter and moved among the men, checking faces, wounds, weapons. Taylor's hand shook as he reloaded the M60's belt. "Sfur, we can't keep this up," he muttered. "The guys are wrecked. We're running low on ammo. And we've got no idea where the hell we are." Walker knelt beside him, leaning against the same tree, feeling the ache in his own muscles grow heavier by the minute. "We're south of the ridge," he said quietly. "We broke their line and angled off. If we keep pushing generally west, we should hit friendlies eventually." "Should," Taylor repeated with a bitter edge. Walker didn't blame him. He felt the same uncertainty gnawing at his gut. The map in his head was built on fragments, terrain features glimpsed through bursts of gunfire, vague compass headings taken in the middle of chaos. But doubt couldn't be allowed to rule. "You want the truth?" Walker asked. Taylor snorted softly. "Out here? Might as well." Walker looked around at the scattered forms of his men, some lying on their backs, staring at nothing, others sitting in silence, boots planted, rifles resting across their laps. "The truth is, they should have wiped us out back there," he said. "We weren't supposed to get this far. They built that ambush to erase us, but we're still here. That means we're already outside the script they wrote for us. Every mile we put between us and that ridge is another piece of their plan falling apart." Taylor was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Fair enough, sir." They shared a brief silence, broken only by the chorus of insects and distant, muffled booms from artillery somewhere far away. One of the younger privates, barely out of high school by the look of him, crawled over, eyes wide in the dim light. "Lieutenant," he said, voice low, "what about the guys we lost contact with? Johnson, Mills, Fletcher. We never saw them after the first blast. There it was." The question that had been hanging in the air since they'd pulled back from the kill zone. Walker felt its weight. He'd seen Mills go down, thrown sideways by the initial Claymore blast. He remembered catching a glimpse of Johnson trying to drag someone toward cover before a tree trunk exploded near them. Fletcher just vanished into the haze. "We don't leave people behind," the private said, the words more like a plea than a statement. Walker could have given the standard answer. "We'll report their last known location, or we'll send a recovery team later." That was the practical, procedural response. But nothing about the last few hours had been procedural. He remembered the look on Jackson's face as he'd reached for the radio handset and come up short. The way the ridge had erupted around them, the sound of men calling to each other and then falling silent. "No," Walker said finally. "We don't." Taylor turned his head sharply. "Sir," Walker met his eyes. "We're getting these men back to friendly territory," he said, nodding toward the wounded clustered under the tree line. "They're my responsibility. But so are the ones still out there on that ridge." "You can't go back," Taylor said. "That hill is crawling with NVA. You'll never make it." Walker didn't answer right away. He looked up through the canopy, seeing none of the stars he knew were above it, only shifting silhouettes of leaves. The jungle didn't care who owned what patch of ground on a map. It swallowed everyone the same. "When the sun comes up," Walker said slowly, "you're going to move these men west. Stay low. Avoid ridge lines. Follow the low ground where you can. Harlan's got patrols out. If anyone's looking for us, they'll be sweeping that direction." Taylor stared at him as the meaning sank in. "You're not coming with us." Walker shook his head once. "I'm going back." A heavy silence fell between them. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. One of the corporals nearby leaned in. "Sir, with all due respect, that's suicide." "Maybe," Walker said. "But you know as well as I do, if those men are still alive, their chances drop to zero if no one goes back for them. I know the layout of that ridge better than anyone now. I know where they hit us from, where we broke out, where they'll expect us not to return. That's the only advantage we have." Taylor's jaw clenched. He was no coward. He'd proven that more than once. But he was thinking like any sane man would about odds, about families back home, about the insanity of walking back into a place designed to kill you. "Let me take a team with you," Taylor said suddenly. Walker shook his head again. "Negative. I need you to get them out." He looked around at the hollow-eyed, exhausted faces staring back at him. "They'll follow you. They trust you. You're steady on that gun and steady under fire. You take point. You move them. You keep them alive. That's your mission now." The burden shifted visibly onto Taylor's shoulders. He swallowed hard, then finally nodded. "Yes, sir." Walker reached out and gripped his shoulder. "You get them home," he said quietly. "That's how this makes sense." That night they slept in shifts, if it could even be called sleep. Walker dozed in short, jagged stretches, waking at every unfamiliar sound, every rustle that didn't match the pattern his ears knew by heart. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, turning the blackness into deep gray, he was already awake. He gathered what supplies he could afford to take: a canteen, extra magazines, a field dressing or two. He left behind anything that would slow him, necessarily. Taylor watched him prepare, the lines under his eyes darker than the bruises on his knuckles. "Sir," Taylor said, "if you don't make it." "Then you lie if you have to," Walker said, a faint edge of wry humor in his voice. "You tell command I went out doing what I was supposed to do." Taylor huffed something like a laugh, but it caught halfway. "You already did that." Walker didn't respond to that. He just slung his rifle, checked the chamber, and took one last look at the men he was leaving in Taylor's care. Most were awake now, watching him, understanding more than he was saying. "Get moving as soon as it's light enough to see 10 yards ahead," Walker said. "Avoid making a straight line, zigzag. Use any streams you find to cover your tracks." "Understood," Taylor said. Then there was nothing left to delay him. Walker turned and stepped back toward the east, into the thickening fog that clung to the low ground as the jungle woke. Within moments, the shapes of the men behind him disappeared into the gray. He didn't look back. Looking back would only slow his steps, and time was the one resource he knew he didn't have. The closer he moved toward the ridge, the more the landscape became a map of memory. Here was the tree that had taken a spray of shrapnel, its bark torn and blackened. There, a patch of ground still scarred from a mortar impact. A torn piece of fabric caught on a root, a spent shell casing half buried in the mud. He moved slower now, every sense extended. The NVA would be alert. They'd know some Americans had broken contact. They might be tracking Taylor's group. They might be sweeping the ridge for wounded and equipment. At any moment, he could stumble into a patrol. He reached the edge of the kill zone just as the sun broke fully through the trees, casting hard shafts of light through the canopy. The place felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The ground still bore the scars of battle. Blood darkened the dirt, discarded bandages, shattered branches, but the dead were mostly gone. The NVA had likely collected their own and left the rest to the jungle. Walker crouched low, scanning the area. "Johnson," he called softly, barely above a whisper. "Mills Fletcher." No answer. Only the distant call of some unseen bird and the ceaseless buzz of insects. He moved forward carefully, checking behind logs, peering into shallow depressions where someone might have crawled to die or to wait. He found a broken helmet, an empty canteen, the torn remnants of a radio handset. Then he saw it. A boot. It was sticking out from behind a collapsed tree trunk, almost invisible under a layer of leaves. Walker's heart hammered. He moved closer, pushing aside branches and vines. Mills lay there, half-conscious, eyes glassy but open. His leg was mangled, but someone, maybe Mills himself, had tied a makeshift tourniquet above the wound. Flies buzzed around him. His lips were cracked. "Lieutenant?" Mills croaked, disbelief shaping his dry voice. "I thought you were dead," Walker finished gently. "Not yet." He knelt and checked the leg, the pulse, the breathing. Mills was in bad shape, but he was alive. Barely. "Anybody else with you?" Walker asked. Mills blinked slowly. "Johnson. He was over there," he whispered, nodding weakly toward a thicket. "Didn't see him after the second blast." Walker squeezed his shoulder. "Stay with me. I'll be back." He moved toward the thicket, every step a risk. He parted the branches and found another body face down, unmoving. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. Then the chest rose, shallow but steady. "Johnson." Walker rolled him gently onto his back. A gash along his scalp had bled heavily, matting his hair, but the wound had clotted. His left arm was twisted at an angle that spoke of a break. "Johnson," Walker said, patting his cheek. "You're not done. Wake up." The younger man stirred, eyelids fluttering. "Sir?" "Yeah," Walker said. "I'm supposed to be dead. You'll get used to it." He had found two. There might have been more. Fletcher was still unaccounted for. But already the clock was ticking louder in his head. The longer they stayed near the ridge, the more likely it became that an NVA patrol would stumble across them. He was one man with 3 wounded. The math was simple. The odds were terrible. But he'd made a promise. If his men had thought he was dead already, then maybe that was exactly what he needed to become in the eyes of the enemy. A ghost moving through their killing ground, taking back what they'd tried to steal. Walker had minutes, maybe less, before the jungle around him shifted again from silence to danger. The NVA didn't leave ambush sites unmonitored for long. They would return to collect intelligence, salvage weapons, and finish off any wounded unlucky enough to still be breathing. He knelt between Johnson and Mills, forcing himself to think in straight lines. 3 wounded men. No radio, no support, no guarantee that Taylor's group had made it out. No clear path through the terrain ahead. But he had one advantage, something the NVA could never take from him. He knew his men, and his men trusted him enough to keep fighting through fear, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. He tightened the strap on Mills's improvised tourniquet and eased Johnson's broken arm into a sling made from a strip of torn uniform. The young corporal winced, but didn't cry out. "Stay quiet," Walker whispered. "If you hear anything, you don't move unless I touch your shoulder. Got it?" Johnson nodded, jaw clenched, sweat running down his temple. Mills could only blink in response, but it was enough. Walker scanned the trees again. The morning light filtered through them in narrow beams. Somewhere deeper in the jungle, birds began to chatter, their sudden calls almost a warning. Someone was coming. It was only a matter of time. He dragged the 2 men toward a natural depression formed by a cluster of boulders and tree roots. It wasn't much, but it offered concealment from 3 sides. He covered them with branches, piled leaves lightly across their legs, and whispered, "If I tell you to crawl, you crawl. If I tell you to run, you run. Otherwise, stay still. I'll draw them off if I have to." Johnson grabbed his wrist weakly. "Sir, don't. You can't fight them alone." Walker met his eyes. "I'm not planning to fight them. I'm planning to outsmart them. And if he had to fight, then so be it." Once they were hidden, he began searching the surrounding area for signs of Fletcher. The 3rd missing soldier couldn't have gone far, not with the way the ambush had collapsed on them. Walker moved in a tight circle around the site, checking torn foliage, disturbed mud, bullet impacts. Every footprint, every scrap of cloth was a clue. Then he saw it, blood smeared along a fallen vine leading toward a hollow at the base of a massive tree. Walker ducked low and moved toward it. When he reached the hollow, he saw a boot, then a leg, then the faint outline of a man curled into the shadows. Fletcher. He looked dead. For a moment, Walker's stomach dropped. But when he touched Fletcher's neck, he felt a slow, weak pulse. "Come on," Walker whispered. "Not you too. Not today." He eased the man out of the hollow. Fletcher was breathing, but shallowly. A wound on his abdomen had been hastily packed with mud and cloth, doing more harm than good. Walker cleaned it with canteen water, biting back frustration. The NVA were close. He could feel it. He dragged Fletcher back to the others and settled him beside Mills and Johnson. 3 wounded now. No cover story, no more illusions. If he stayed here, they would all die. He needed a plan. He crouched beside the 3 men, thinking. A ridge lay behind them, a death trap. Ahead was raw jungle. To the west, friendly lines. But getting there meant moving 3 men who could barely stand. He couldn't carry them all. But he could make the enemy think he wasn't here. He moved again, this time with a purpose. He scouted a path leading west, clearing branches quietly, marking trees with tiny cuts invisible unless you knew to look for them. A trail only he would notice. Then he returned to the kill zone and began crafting the illusion. Footprints leading north. Drag marks away from the hollow. A discarded bandage dropped where an NVA tracker would see it. Signs of a wounded man being carried off. He built a false path, one that looked desperate, frantic, believable. He used everything he knew about how the NVA tracked Americans. He used everything he'd learned from being hunted by them. By the time he returned to the hollow, he was drenched in sweat. "We're leaving," he whispered. "Right now." He hoisted Fletcher over his shoulder, grabbed Mills under one arm, and told Johnson, "Stay on my heels. If you fall, you crawl until I pull you up." Johnson nodded, swallowing the pain. Step by step, inch by inch, they moved west. Walker's legs burned. His ribs throbbed. His vision blurred at the edges. But he didn't stop. Then voices. Multiple. Moving fast. He pushed the men down into the brush. They froze as dark shapes appeared between the trees and VA soldiers, rifles ready, moving exactly along the false trail he'd built. 2 patrols, then 3, then a 4th, sweeping wide around the ridge. They followed his false signs without hesitation. Walker kept his breathing slow, body still, eyes tracking their silhouettes until the jungle swallowed them whole. Only when the last echo of footsteps faded did he move again. 2 hours later, the terrain shifted. The jungle thinned slightly, giving way to lower ground. He recognized the smell clay, not mud, a sign they were nearing areas mapped by U.S. patrols. Then he heard it, distant, muffled, but unmistakable. An M60, American, not far. Walker straightened, adrenaline hitting him like a second heart. "Stay with me," he whispered. We're close. He helped Johnson forward, dragged Fletcher, guided Mills between steps. His entire world narrowed to keeping them upright, keeping them breathing, keeping them moving toward that sound. Finally, movement ahead. Green and brown helmets. American silhouettes. A patrol. A Marine corporal raised his rifle. Hold it right there. Walker stepped into the open, raising one hand, the other still gripping Mills's webbing. Lieutenant James Walker, he said, voice raw and hoarse. 3 survivors. Multiple wounds. We need a medic. The Marines stared first in confusion, then in disbelief. Lieutenant, they told us you were dead. Walker nodded once. They were wrong. The Marines sprinted forward, calling for stretcher teams, corpsmen, the platoon sergeant. Walker felt hands take the weight off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he let himself sag. Then Captain Harlan pushed through the crowd, eyes wide. Jim, how the hell? Walker didn't smile. He didn't collapse. Just looked his CO in the eye. I came back, he said. I didn't come back alone. Behind him, the wounded were lifted onto stretchers. Johnson saluted weakly. Mills whispered something that might have been thank you. Fletcher clung to consciousness. Harlan shook his head slowly. You just walked through hell. Walker finally allowed his legs to give out, steadying himself against a tree as a corpsman checked his wounds. I didn't walk, he corrected quietly. I crawled. And in that moment, sweat-soaked, blood-covered, half-conscious, barely standing, he looked more like a survivor than any man alive. But his voice didn't shake when he added, They thought I was dead. Let them think it. Because while they were looking for a corpse, I was bringing my men home.